I didn't expect my name to be erased in a room full of people who shared my blood. But there I was, standing at my father's retirement dinner, when my brother leaned into the microphone and thanked everyone who had actually carried this family forward. Then he looked straight at me and smiled. Security touched my elbow before I could react. Quietly, politely, like I was an inconvenience being tidied away. I remember the scrape of the chair. The way conversations didn't stop, just lowered in pitch, as if humiliation were background music. Something inside me split, clean and final. Not rage. Clarity. I nodded, removed my badge, and placed it on the table like a receipt. As I walked out, applause resumed behind me, thinner than before. They thought it ended there. It didn't. Before I continue, tell me where you're listening from. I've always been the reliable one, not the brilliant one, not the charming one, the one who showed up early, stayed late, and fixed what others broke without asking for credit. My name is Caleb Mercer, and in my family, that trait was never admired. It was exploited. Growing up, I learned quickly where I fit. My older brother Julian was the vision. Loud, ambitious, born with the kind of confidence that made adults lean in when he spoke. My parents treated him like a promise already fulfilled. I was the insurance policy, the quiet son who would catch things if they fell apart. And they fell apart often. My father, Richard, ran a mid-sized logistics firm and liked to call it a family business, though that mostly meant unpaid weekends and favors disguised as opportunities. My mother, Helen, managed emotions the way others managed finances, by minimizing risk. Conflict was dangerous. Silence was safer. Whenever Julian crossed a line, she smoothed it over. Whenever I was hurt, she reminded me I was strong enough to handle it. You don't need praise, she used to say. You're solid. What she meant was Julian needs more. By my late 20s, I was quietly paying bills that weren't mine, covering shortfalls at the company, signing paperwork I wasn't fully briefed on because you understand numbers better. I told myself this was loyalty, responsibility, love. Even. Meanwhile, Julian failed upward. New title, new office, same chaos. The only person who ever questioned it was my Aunt Margaret, my mother's older sister. She watched more than she spoke. And when she did, it was always later, always privately. She'd squeeze my shoulder at family gatherings and say things like, "Just because you can carry the weight doesn't mean it belongs to you." At the time, I smiled and shrugged it off. That was easier than admitting she might be right. There were signs. Looking back, conversations that stopped when I entered a room, decisions made for my own good, praise that sounded suspiciously like permission to be used. But I was invested in keeping the peace. I believed that if I stayed steady long enough, I'd eventually be seen. What I didn't understand then was this: in families like mine, usefulness is mistaken for worth. And once you accept that role, it's very hard to step out of it without consequences. That night at the dinner wasn't the beginning of my story. It was the moment I realized I'd been cast in the wrong one. After that dinner, nothing exploded right away. That's how pressure works in families like mine. It doesn't arrive as a crisis. It tightens quietly, one expectation at a time, until breathing feels optional. Julian started calling more. Not to apologize, to delegate. He framed it as trust, as brotherhood. "You're the only one I can rely on," he'd say, usually right before asking me to step in financially or smooth something over with a client he'd alienated. The company was struggling, he claimed. Temporary gaps, cash flow hiccups. I didn't ask for spreadsheets anymore. I already knew the pattern. My parents leaned in too, subtle at first. A comment over dinner about how stressful things were for Julian. A sigh about how much pressure he was under. Then the asks became explicit. Could I front alone? Could I put my name on a contract? Just for now? Could I delay my own plans because the family needed stability? Every request came wrapped in the same language: family helps family. And every time I hesitated, Helen's tone would soften into something dangerously gentle. "We're just asking until things settle," she'd say. "You know we wouldn't do this if there were another option." There was always another option. It just never involved Julian sacrificing anything. The moral line was crossed the day Richard slid a folder across my kitchen table. Inside were revised ownership documents. My name appeared everywhere: leases, guarantees, liabilities. Julian's barely visible. I stared at the pages, feeling something cold move through my chest. "This protects everyone," my father said quickly. "It's temporary." I asked one question. If it's temporary, why isn't Julian signing? The silence that followed was loud. Helen busied herself with the sink. Richard cleared his throat. Julian laughed it off, clapped me on the shoulder, said I was overthinking it, that I always did. And I signed. Not because I believed them, but because I was exhausted. Because pushing back meant becoming the problem. Because I still thought keeping the peace was the same thing as being loved. But something had shifted. I started noticing how often my money moved without my input. How often decisions were announced, not discussed. How easily they assumed I'd comply. I began reading contracts at night. Quietly. Carefully. I stopped correcting their stories. I listened. What I saw wasn't chaos. It was design. They weren't careless. They were comfortable. Comfortable, letting me absorb risk. Consequences. Blame while they stayed clean. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I stayed silent. But silence, I learned, can be preparation. And by then, the strings were already tight enough to snap. The breaking point didn't come during an argument. It came during a celebration. Julian's promotion was announced at a company-wide event held in a downtown hotel. Polished floors. Open bar. Applause timed to feel organic. I stood near the back, as I always did, watching my brother accept praise for a turnaround I knew he hadn't delivered. The numbers had stabilized because I'd quietly covered the deficits. Again, when Julian took the stage, he thanked our parents. He thanked the board. He thanked the team that believed in the vision. Then he paused, smiled, and added, "Some people are great supporters. Others are leaders." The room laughed softly. I felt eyes slide toward me, then away. Afterward, I went to the bar to steady myself. That's when the CFO approached, confusion written all over his face. "Hey," he said casually. "Quick question. Why are you listed as the primary guarantor? On the Horizon deal, I thought Julian was handling that." The words landed like a blow. I didn't answer. I walked away, pulled up the contract on my phone, and read it again, this time without trust clouding my vision. Every risk-bearing clause was mine. Every exit was his. If the deal collapsed, I'd lose everything. He'd lose nothing. I found Julian near the terrace, laughing with investors. When I confronted him, his smile didn't fade. It sharpened. "Relax," he said. "You're good for it. That's why we use you." Use you. The phrase echoed louder than the music, louder than the city below us. In that moment, something inside me finally gave way, not in anger, but in understanding. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't favoritism. It was intentional. I looked at my parents, standing nearby, watching us. Neither intervened. Neither looked surprised. My mother's eyes flickered with something like worry, not for me, but for the scene. And that was it. The final fracture. I realized I had spent years trying to earn a place that was never meant for me. I wasn't overlooked. I was positioned carefully, strategically, to absorb impact. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I simply nodded. That night, I went home and opened my laptop. I reviewed every document, every payment, every signature. For the first time, I wasn't trying to fix anything. I was preparing to change everything. And once that decision was made, there was no going back. Clarity has a strange effect. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it, and suddenly, the leverage becomes obvious. I spent 2 nights going through records I'd never questioned before. Contracts, bank statements, lease agreements, vendor payments. What I found wasn't chaos. It was meticulous. Nearly every major obligation: the office lease, the equipment financing, the emergency credit line was in my name. My signature, my credit, my risk. Julian didn't run the company. I financed it. They had dressed it up as trust, responsibility. But legally, it was something else entirely. Control. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't warn them. I did exactly what they'd always praised me for. I handled things quietly. First came the emails. Short, professional, emotionless. Notices of withdrawal, termination of personal guarantees, non-renewal of bridge financing. Each message copied the necessary parties and nothing more. No accusations, no explanations, just dates and compliance language. Then I called the bank, then the landlord, then the vendors. By the end of the second day, the structure they'd leaned on for years began to tremble. Julian called first. Angry, confused, accusatory. I let it ring. My mother followed, her voice tight with panic. "What are you doing?" she asked. "You're going to ruin everything." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply said, "I'm stepping out of obligations that aren't mine to carry." There was silence on the line, the kind that happens when manipulation stops working. The only person who didn't sound surprised was Margaret. She came by that evening, sat across from me at my kitchen table, and listened as I laid it all out. When I finished, she nodded once. I wondered how long it would take. She said, "I'm proud of you." She connected me with an attorney she trusted, Daniel Crow. Precise, unflinching. He confirmed what I already suspected: I was well within my rights. More than that, I'd been generous longer than required. As the days passed, something unexpected happened. The panic around me grew, but inside me, it quieted. For the first time, my stability wasn't being siphoned away. I slept. I ate. I breathed without bracing for the next request. I wasn't taking revenge. I was reclaiming agency. They had mistaken my silence for consent. They were about to learn the difference. They demanded a meeting. Not asked, demanded. Urgent texts. Missed calls. A tone that shifted from outrage to desperation in less than 24 hours. Daniel advised: a public, neutral space. Visibility creates accountability. He said, so we chose the glass atrium of a downtown hotel, open, bright, impossible to control. When I arrived, my family was already there. Julian paced near the windows, jacket off, jaw tight. My parents sat together on a leather bench, whispering urgently. They all stopped when they saw me. Not with relief, with calculation. "You've made your point," Julian said as I approached. "Now fix it." I didn't sit. I didn't greet anyone. Daniel stepped forward instead, calm and deliberate, a leather folder tucked under his arm. "I represent Caleb Mercer," he said evenly. "This meeting is to clarify boundaries, not negotiate guilt." Julian scoffed. "Boundaries? You can't just pull funding and walk away. You'll destroy the company." Daniel opened the folder. "My client didn't pull funding. He withdrew personal guarantees he was never contractually obligated to provide. The company is still free to operate without using him as collateral." My mother stood abruptly. This is family, she snapped. You don't involve lawyers. Daniel met her gaze without flinching. Families don't expose one member to disproportionate financial risk without informed consent. Silence fell. Julian lunged for humor. Then anger. You always do this, he said to me. You play victim when things get hard. I finally spoke. No. I stayed quiet when things got hard. This is what happens when I stop. Daniel slid copies of the documents onto the table highlighted sections. Timelines. Signatures. He explained the structure calmly. Methodically. The guarantees. The liabilities. The pattern. My father's face drained of color as realization set in. This could bankrupt us, Richard said weakly. Daniel nodded. Which is why it should never have been arranged this way. Julian's composure cracked. You think this makes you powerful, he hissed at me. You're nothing without us. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time without nostalgia or hope clouding my vision. I was something for you, I said quietly. That's not the same thing. My mother began to cry. Not softly. Loudly. Accusatory tears. How could you do this to your brother? She asked. After everything we gave you, Daniel closed the folder. This meeting is over, he said. My client has outlined his terms. No further financial involvement. All communication through counsel. Any attempt to coerce or retaliate will be documented. Julian slammed his hand against the glass wall, drawing glances from nearby guests. You'll regret this. I met his eyes. Steady. I already regretted staying. Security approached not for me, but for him. As Daniel and I walked away, I felt something unfamiliar in my chest. Not triumph, not bitterness. Release. Outside, the city moved on as it always had, cars. Voices. Life continuing without regard for the drama behind glass walls. I stood there for a moment, breathing in air that felt unclaimed. For the first time, I wasn't leaving in disgrace. I was leaving with my boundaries intact. And that changed everything. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments: missed payments, resigned board members, hushed conversations I was no longer part of. The company didn't collapse overnight, but it shrank, without my guarantees cushioning every bad decision. Reality finally caught up with them. Julian blamed everyone but himself. He cycled through anger, denial, and performative remorse, depending on who was listening. My parents withdrew into silence. When they did speak, it was cautious, fragile, as if any wrong word might fracture what little remained. I kept my distance, not out of spite, but out of clarity. Margaret stayed close. She checked in without prying, supported without directing. When my mother fell ill briefly from stress, Margaret made sure she was cared for without pulling me back into the center of the storm. It was the first time an elder in my family protected me. I started over quietly. I sold the condo tied to old obligations and moved into a smaller place near the water. I took a consulting role that paid less but required honesty instead of loyalty tests. For the first time in years, my calendar belonged to me. No emergency calls. No guilt-laced favors. Healing wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. I stopped bracing when my phone rang. I slept through the night. I noticed how much of my life I'd spent managing other people's emotions at the expense of my own. One evening, standing on my balcony as the sun dipped behind the city, it hit me: freedom wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It arrived when I finally stopped explaining my worth to people who benefited from doubting it. Family, I learned, isn't defined by blood alone. It's defined by respect, by boundaries that are honored, not punished, by love that doesn't require you to disappear to keep the peace. I don't know if my parents will ever fully understand what they lost by protecting one son at the expense of another. I don't wait for that understanding anymore. What I know is this: choosing yourself doesn't make you cruel. It makes you whole. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own story, if you've been carrying weight that was never yours, know this: you're allowed to put it down. And when you do, something better has room to grow.